come to Art 3, and we're trying to bring together two very great artists who were largely contemporaneous, George O'Keeffe and Max Ernst, who were present at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century when a complete revolution in civilization was happening. Its ostensible exterior wave front was art. And the revolution in art from about 1870 to about 1930 was phenomenal. In that 60-year period, art changed radically forever. The first genius in that whole development was Monet. And Monet discovered that he had an uncanny ability that when he was painting in nature, that he discovered that there were certain places and certain modes of his character that he could bring into sync with certain places, and that he could be totally absorbed in nature to the extent that his seeing became reflectively refined in his mind so that he could literally see what he was seeing, not just see the images out there, but he could see also within his mind the impressions of the images, and he is the developer and founder of Impressionism. And he discovered that there were very few people who could do this. He used to paint with Renoir, who is one of the world's greatest painters. But when Renoir's paintings come out, they're gorgeous, but they're not impressionistic so much. They're just of Renoir gorgeousness. Whereas Monet, more and more, his impressions began to fascinate him, and they began to have a quality of almost abstraction to them. And in this abstractedness, what was real was color. And color, of course, is the fractionating of light by frequency. A very high energy color would be ultraviolet or blue. A very lower energy would be red. And if it gets too low, it goes to infrared. Or if it gets too high, it goes to ultraviolet. And we can't see those, and yet they also leave impressions on us. And so there are times where Monet's seeing and his paintings began to fascinate certain people, and one of them was named Cézanne, Paul Cézanne. As Cézanne began to see that his impressions were not just color so much, but that the colors ran in certain lines. And the beginnings of what eventually became Cubism occur in Cézanne, because Cézanne's composition tends to see that the colors have edge forces which he could see and could paint. And all of this happened about the time that photography was beginning. And it was considered almost a death knell for like realistic painting, because photography could supposedly do it so much better. And yet in the midst of all of this came photographic geniuses like Stieglitz and Steichen, who realized that photographs could be works of art. They don't have to just record, but one could also have impressionistic photographs. And one of Stieglitz's early subjects for such soirees into photographic art was to photograph clouds and the different swirls and the impressions of not just the clouds, but the impression of the sky as a dynamic field, as an energized field, and slowly began to transfer that quality of seeing to portraits and to people. When he was already very accomplished, he met George O'Keeffe, and after a number of years they were married, and for about 10 years they were the greatest couple in the art world. And this is one of his portraits of George O'Keeffe. He began to see in her a quality that was as mysterious as the impression of the sky. And in a very interesting way, George O'Keeffe, on her own, discovered that she had a quality very much like Monet, that she could immerse herself into nature almost completely so that her mind was completely natural, no longer just integrated experience, no longer just integrated meaning, no longer just had some kind of referential, representational identification with existential things, but that nature itself is a vast mysteriousness began to occur to her in her open mind. And in our learning, we're understanding that this is the way in which consciousness emerges. And when consciousness emerges out of the structure of the mind, it has a dynamic quality of infiniteness. And if you put a consciousness of consciousness in an open mind, you get a very wonderful, very rarefied, we're tempted to say event, but it's really like an event horizon. It's as if one were staring at an open sky, and then one intensified, so you no longer stared at, but you looked at the open sky, and then you intensified that, and you looked into the openness of the sky and sensed their presence. That a more intense quality of openness is presence in the midst of openness. And one begins to see that there is like a quality of enrichment flowing in openness. That openness is not bland, it's not drab. And that what then can emerge out of that intensified pressure within openness of presence is a new form of lines and colors and composing that makes something spiritual. And one learns to see holy in a holy way. One learns that sacredness is not an idea, but an actuality, but not an actuality that is there just in things qua things, or an experience just cultural and tribal and everyday, nor in the mind that just is normally functional, but that the holiness is a presencing of consciousness within the openness of nature. And that nature is mysterious because it allows for the more intense pressures of invisible consciousness within its vast Tao. Now, how that happens used to be very difficult to convey, but because of our learning, because of the phases, we can convey it this way. Our phases alternate between a process and a form. And the old way of wisdom teaching was always like that. Nature as a process delivers the forms of existence in their limited ritual actions. And so karma is very objective. It's what really happens. It's what you do. But out of that comes another process, which is experience. But out of experience as a process comes another form, which is the mind. And it's out of the mind that the process of consciousness occurs. And it's out of the process of consciousness that spirit forms, art forms, persons, differential persons form. And out of what forms in that way, a fourth process occurs, which is called history, and is not at all what is normally called history, and not chronologies. It has that, but transformed differentially many times over. And out of the historical process, out of historical consciousness, comes science. And the largest science form is the cosmos itself. And the cosmos is objective, but differentially objective. It has an infinity facet to it. And out of the form of the cosmos comes the process of nature. So nature is the follow process released by the cosmos itself. And so nature is mysterious because it has the allness of the cosmos specifically available for transformation, for change, and that's why nature always can be characterized in the Chinese ancient mode. Nature is a sea of change. And so one gets the book of changes out of that, the I Ching. Because one can follow that the changes in nature definitely have cyclic qualities which occur, and as they occur, anything that comes out of their occurrence, any form that comes out of it, will have the earmarks of the parentage. They'll carry the DNA form. And so what comes out of nature are the ritual objective forms of existence, the figures of actual objectivity, but they also will have the parentage of change. And so it is possible for ritual objectivity to also change. So that just because something exists in a certain form out of nature, it still has the ability to be transformed, to be changed. You can take sodium and chlorine and pair them together as sodium chloride and have salt. And there are many kinds of salts. You can use all kinds of elements that are very similar to chlorine. You can use bromine, iodine, fluorine. There are many elements similar to sodium, potassium, calcium, so forth. So there are many kinds of salts. They all share, as all elements do, in their elements as well as in their molecular structure, that they are able to be changed. And they will keep their objectivity even though one has changed it. You can dye salt red or blue or whatever you want to do. Or you can dissolve it in water and make a solution out of it. Or you can even, with enough technology, you can vaporize it and make it into almost like a gaseous quality. So that everything contains the characteristics of its origin into its phase, which means that as the phases go on and they accrue, each succeeding phase gains in the complexity of the layerings of its origin. And by the time you get to the mind, that fourth phase of symbols, the mind is so complex already that it has all the heritage of nature, of existence, of mythic experience and character, and also of its own symbolic form, its own ability to have thought. Consciousness is even more sophisticated and has an even farther complexity and reach, so that by the time you get to spiritual forms, like persons and works of art, they're so complex that it is no longer able to be put into a simple integral target of formation, but it has a scintillating jewel-like, multifaceted quality to it. But what happens here is that while the experience of art forms is differential, the experience of symbol forms is always integral. So when one comes to the experience out of which the symbol forms emerge, in art, you have to pair that in a complementary way with the flow of consciousness going in a different direction from experience, so that they weave, so that the symbol forms which are integral and the art forms which are differential weave also, but they weave in form, not just in process. So that the frame, the square of attention, the frame of what one looks at when art is available, is that the symbolic integral of experience now has an equal, perfect expressiveness when done right, with the consciousness making it into a personal art form. Here is one of the most interesting paintings of young George O'Keeffe. It's called Black Abstraction, 1927. She had, at this point, been married to Stieglitz for about 9 years. They were at the top of the pecking order in the art world in New York and Paris and many places, very famous. And she was having trouble with a lump on one of her breasts. And so she had to go into the hospital. And the lump was removed. And thankfully for her, it was a benign tumor, but nevertheless, it scared her. It defaced her femininity. And about that time, her husband began entertaining the attentions of a young woman who came to help him run their studio called a New American Place, gallery, meeting place, one of the most famous places in New York of the 1920s. Then another lump was discovered, and she had to go back to the hospital and have that removed. And at the same time, the affair, which now had developed between her husband and this younger woman, led to her having, in 1932, a nervous breakdown. And she had to go to Bermuda to try to recover, and then came back, and then went up to York Beach, Maine, to try and recover. And what she was able to recover was the quality that she had been not allowed to live for the 10 years that she was with Stieglitz, with her husband, because he was always with people, wall-to-wall people, tapestried all the time, relatives, friends, international things, whereas she had discovered her presence in the openness of her mind by herself, out in nature. One of the things that, as a young woman, she had read was Emerson's Nature, written in 1836, a little 95-page book, and it had come out of Emerson's crisis in his life. Emerson came from a family of very famous preachers in Boston. They were the top of the social order. And Emerson became one of the most outstanding ministers in the Boston of his day. And then his beautiful young wife died, and he couldn't preach anymore. And so he resigned. And in order to try to clear himself out, he wrote Nature, where he realized that the holy book that he would now have to talk from was not the Bible, but was nature itself. And that his congregation was no longer the First Unitarian Church of Boston, but was the entire world. And so he learned, and in nature one finds for the first time a kind of a transcendentalist quality that when nature is held in its openness, the quality of your mind, if it is also open, makes an intensity of consciousness that's almost like a lasering of light. Instead of just seeing by light, one now sees in a lasering fashion. One sees coherently. And because one can see consciously, coherently, one's character and your experience becomes integral to that lasering quality. And when the character of experience is complemented by the lasering of conscious presencing, that's when you get something like Cézanne's Monseigneur Victor or Monet's Impressionism. It can be expressed in art. It can also be expressed in science, but it takes several transforms to be able to do that in science. Whereas science is an analytic, art is a critique, a critiquable form. Science are always analytic forms, different, higher process of refinement. Not higher in more important, higher in the energy that it takes to do it, to affect that. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is a great work of art. The cosmos is an infinite work of art. One of the qualities that comes out of this is that while experience is able now to flow in a complement with consciousness, the mind now is a complement to the works of art, so that symbols complement person. And when symbol and person complement each other, it's in that weaving interplay that you get the facets of possibility. And one can even go a very high intensity into it and see that every possibility also has a spectrum of possibilities. And so one gets into a very interesting situation. If the mind, in its symbolic capacity, has not matured itself through the integral cycle in the right way, it becomes afraid of this. Because it begins to sense, well, then there's no bottom. Then everything is just suspended in who knows how open openness is. Or one can't decide on anything because there are so many possibilities and one ends up de facto in limbo. And many other possibilities. So that the balanced integral of the symbolic mind is natural with the jewel-like spiritual holiness of consciousness brought into art form. But it's very difficult if the balance is not with, not just even, and not just in equilibrium, but in the dynamic of the complementarity. Because integral forms hold their integral by polarization. You cannot have atomic structure without having a positive and negative electromagnetism. Nothing will hold. Everything would just be a highly energized plasma and there would be no things. And so polarity is a fundamental quality of objectivity in the universe. The universe itself is objective as distinct from the cosmos because it is one thing, a universe. But in experience, what serves as a polarity very often for the experience of living forms is gender. The male, the female, is like there in all levels of the process of experience for every living kind of being. Plants have gender. Animals have gender. Insects. There are microorganisms. The development of gender in life, in experience, on this planet is about 3.6 billion years old. In the universe, it's about 12, 13 billion years old. Life on this planet was organic for about 2 billion years before there were any other levels of life forms. And yet, bacteria developed gender because of a very specific reality that happens in nature. Because the way that energy in the natural process occurs in the universe is largely through radiation. Light is a radiation form. And radiation always will break down and damage any kind of an RNA or DNA structure eventually. And it will not be able to repair itself without having the ability to have two DNAs exchange with each other, and they happen to fill in the missing parts of what has been damaged in one. And so sexuality has evolved in the universe to help in the complementarity to repair the natural wear and tear that happens in a radiation universe. And so it's not at all Freudian. It's not at all cultural. It is endemic with the experience of organic life on level of entities. But when it comes to the complexity of human beings, like, say, in the early 20th century, after not only 5,000 years of civilization, but 40,000 years of art sophistication, and that within 160,000 years of species development, and that within 500,000 years of cognate species development, Homo Neanderthal, and that within 2 million years of a cognate species, Homo erectus. All of these layerings convey and keep accruing so that by our lifetimes, a human being is capable of an enormous differential complexity, literally beyond belief. One of the beautiful little books I have brought is by Max Ernst, and it's called Beyond Painting. That there is a quality to art where it isn't just art, but becomes really fine art. Really fine art can become tremendously great art. And great art has the ability to be spiritually holy, incredibly refined. And its quality is to give a jewel-like scintillation in form to what would be ineffable to the mind, to what would be not expressible in the body otherwise. But now the body and the mind, because they can both change, they can both transform, they can absorb a complementation, not only from consciousness, but from art forms themselves. And so what art does then, at a certain level of sophistication, it substitutes, it exchanges places with ritual. And instead of existence being based on karma, one is freed from that forever because of spiritual jewel-like differentiality. Instead of existentials just being codified the way in which they precipitated out of nature, they are now alchemically available to be modified and changed in many almost unlimited ways. And just so, one's character now, instead of just being exactly what it was naturally, is able to assume facets so that one could have many facets to one's character. And so you get a very interesting situation. On a tribal level, one would be afraid not to be oneself. You must be who you are. You must be and fit in with the tribe and be exactly who you are. And if you're in this clan, you're in that clan. Whereas an artistic, spiritual person has many facets. Like a great actor can play many roles, inhabit many qualities of character, and never lose themselves, even though they are able to play these different roles. But one of the provisos is that if you're playing in that kind of a episode, one wants to stay in character. Don't introduce some disparate character into a role that calls for a different kind of character. And so you have to keep a certain kind of resonant set order. A great actor will be able to, in their lifetime, maybe do several dozen roles, and they're never different from themselves. And it comes into a very humorous quality sometimes. Great actors really come into this. One of the greatest women actors of the 20th century was Ingrid Bergman. And every time she was in a film, she had a technique that she actually would fall in love with her leading man, whoever it was. Bogart in Casablanca, Cary Grant in one movie, Gary Cooper in another. And Gary Cooper once said, as soon as the film was over, you couldn't get her on the phone. Because she only inhabited that character and that role for the duration of that filming, and who she was very, very much different from that. Though Cooper said before he couldn't get her on the phone, he said, I've never had a woman love me as real as Ingrid Bergman during the filming of that movie. And he said, I don't know what happened. But he certainly did, because he played many roles to the nth degree. One of the first talking pictures that he was in was called The Virginian, and 1929. And if you see it, you realize how great he was, even as a fresh out of Montana ranching farm boy. He was already incredibly refined, and he's up next to Walter Huston, John Huston's father, and Richard Arlen, who was a famous actor in the late 20s, early 30s. Anyway, you can see, so Cooper did know very much. A great artist is like that any thing that they're doing, work of art that they're in, their scintillation not only occurs as a character, but it differentially distributes itself in the entire field. But the field is not just experience, the field is also the complementarity of consciousness. And so, though they're not yogic intellectuals able to tell you what this is, they do it. And they do it immediately great. At a conference one time at the University of Virginia, a reluctant hermit, social hermit like William Faulkner, agreed to give interviews for a semester to the students. And one student asked him one time, Mr. Faulkner, what is your favorite work of yours? And he said, oh my dear, the next one. Whatever it is I'm working on is my favorite work now. So the artist falls in love with their work of art. And so one of the qualities of spirit, presence, is that it always carries the vibrancy and the frequency of love with it. It's not that it's put there, it's that it is of that. And so consciousness, rather than being an abstraction, the idea of consciousness in the mind is an abstraction, but consciousness, pure in its process, is like a pure love. But not a pure love as an integral thing, but as a differential field. And it has this ability, because it is love, to exchange with the process of the mystery of nature as if they were lovers, so that consciousness and nature marry. They marry in such a way that now the world that is born out of that is magical, is capable of holy magic. And it's this holy magic that once is glimpsed by a great artist, they can never forget it. And for Georgia O'Keeffe, she realized that she could not ever again live in the big city with tapestry of all kinds of people. She had to go and find her presence within the openness of nature, and that's when she went to New Mexico. And interesting enough, not only did she get her house in Abiquiu, but eventually the land that called out to her was called Ghost Ranch. That it was the phantom of the phenomenal world that was now a holy spirit for her. And one finds in her later works, after she had emerged from having survived a kind of a urban crucifixion, that she could come to where the openness of the landscape could hold symbol of death and not be depressive, to be holy. And when she gained that quality, there was immediately the recognition that her works of art have a spirit holy tone to them that is incredible. The photos don't quite show it, but when you see them in person, they touch you with a presencing love that is really high spirit. You feel that. It's like the first time that one sees a Rembrandt, and you feel the tone of that high, noble, holy excellence of Rembrandt. And that a Rembrandt is worth anything that one can pay for it, because it is so rare to find that expressed in that way. And yet, every human being has the capacity to access that in themselves. Not in themselves, but to mature themselves to be of that field. And that's what this education is about. Not just to mature special wisdom student, but to broadcast it to the whole planet so it never need be esoteric again. It never need be lost again, but will have a method and a form. Children can do it and go through and be able to access the scale of themselves in this differential mode. And when that is done, what occurs is a truly high magic harmonic. In any moment where you have that epiphany of your reality in that extent, there is a concomitant harmonic, which is a theophany, that the cosmos knows you. And you're not just home in something, you're home with it all. You belong there. You live there. Frank Lloyd Wright said, if I have built a house right, you will never imagine that house being anywhere but where it is, because it will belong there. Let's take a break. Let's come back, and let's come back to the way in which complementarities occur. It's very, very important to see the play of complementarities. If we're dealing with integral structures, you can structure them so that they can stay there. They're apparently phenomenal, but complementarities are noumenal, and if they are reduced to phenomenality, they lose their conscious dimension, they lose their personal dimension, and they no longer have the ability to generate historical energy, which means that there's no way then to get the resonances of the harmonic consciousness into the forms or the processes. And of course, the process that then suffers is experience. Because experience, instead of opening up consciously to one's personal quality, to one's artistic capability, to one's spirit scintillated formedness, one comes back to experience in a regressive way. And experience, when it is regressed, makes you a sitting duck for ideologies, for doctrines, and for regimentation into ritual masses. So once one gains consciousness, once one gains one's artistic, holy personage form, to thrust someone back into that kind of a regression entails all kinds of complications that come out. The key to it is that the process of differentiation involves two qualities that emerge eventually as love, as the quality of love. Not just attraction, not duty, not possessiveness, not desire. It's a different quality. Desire, Kama Sutra, desire is a ritual taste in integral experience. But love is a differential energy in personal exploration. Totally different operations. There is no karma in love. There's resonance and there's harmony. It's a different quality altogether. The two qualities of process that occur in consciousness, one of them is creative imagination, which works with remembering. Consciousness itself purely is a remembering. But when creative imagination comes into play, the creative imagination has the ability to remember, and it remembers not in categories, because it's not an integral mode. And it's a process, not a form, so that it remembers in play. So the importance of play is that it is the process of remembering in consciousness when creative imagination is also in play, literally in play. So that the emergence of a person is a completely different phenomena from the achievement of stable individuality or the development of character or the training of one's figured actions. You can inculcate ritual actions. You can fortify character, and you can establish individuality. And yet, the sense of one's person, conscious person, is at least two orders beyond the capacity of the mind to have an individuality. And so the spiritual person is very high energy form, enormously high energy form. So high that in the Renaissance the saying was, man is a microcosm. Is literally the entirety, not just of the universe, but of the cosmic harmonic in themselves. And one of the proofs of this is that two human beings can meet harmonically so that they literally do not just become one, but they become each other's spectrum. It's like that. And this is a magical thing. It is also possible to have communities not based on political structure, but on aesthetic harmonics. And in the 21st century, some of the challenges that are there for our civilization that's just now emerging is to have aesthetic harmonic forms of sociality rather than political doctrine formations, rather than have ideological regimentations. One literally can mature out of the need for laws and codes and doctrines and ideologies, not that they're no longer applicable to one, but that they no longer even occur or exist. The heavens do not work by laws, but they work by resonances that have harmonics, like gravity, magnetism. There's no Bill of Rights necessary in magnetism. There's no tort book that's necessary for electromagnetism. And so our freedom is all tied with the achievement of our person. And as persons who, once they acquire the differential spectrum, not just of themselves, but a person making creatively, they then become sacred beings and to each other recognizable. And when their communities come together, those communities also resonate in that way. There is such a thing as a jeweled life. So play is very important in art. And what plays in the formal way are symbols and the artist, or symbols and the appreciator. The person who is enjoying that work of art, in the enjoyment of it, it is their person playing with the symbols in the work and in their own mind symbols playing in the work, and the work's symbols playing in their mind, makes this kind of formal do-si-do play interchange, which means that the weaving interchange between experience and consciousness also is a play mode of weaving. And when experience gets woven with consciousness, it becomes scintillating. Every aspect of the flow of experience, images, feelings, language, becomes spontaneously refined. Not just refined to be better, but refined to be infinitely, possibly, of greater and greater interest. So that one's imagery now becomes incandescent. You don't just see something that is phenomenally there. It is like really there with you, being really there with it. And one's sense of play then makes experience scintillating, becomes alchemical, as the old saying used to be. So art is not only important because it is a high establishment of maturity in the world or in persons, but it introduces noumenal forms for the first time into a universe that until then, for you, or for the society, or for the planet, the star system, whatever it happens to be, up until that point, it hasn't been there. And the first art forms on this planet were about 40,000 years ago. In the Paleolithic caves of northern Spain, southern France, southern Germany, going up into the center of Central Europe, are the first time that you find art forms, because it's the first time that our species, Homo sapiens, arrived in those landscapes. Though Homo sapiens as a species originated in southern Africa about 160,000 years ago, it took about 100,000 years to build up a population and a movement that was large enough to exceed the African continent. And we followed the same path that many Homo cognate species before us followed. 2 million years ago, Homo erectus matured to the population and the capacity and left Africa much in the same way and populated most of the world all the way to Indonesia, all the way to many parts of North Africa and the Middle East. And so Homo erectus pioneered that 2 million years ago. And Homo neanderthal followed about 500,000 years ago, and one finds for the first time a species of Homo neanderthal cognate not only in China, but in what is today Israel. The earliest Neanderthal burial that we know of is in Israel on Mount Carmel, just above the port of Haifa. And around that body of 200,000 years ago is an outline of ancient Paleolithic seeds, which meant that the body had been covered in flowers. But that's not an art form, that's a ritual of consecration. It's not the same as when one finds a Paleolithic cave like Lascaux about 20,000 years ago. And the first thing that one would have seen entering Lascaux is immediately on the left is the head, just the head, of a black stallion. And as one would go through the long length of the axial nave of the Cathedral of Lascaux, at the far end, one would find on a stalactite coming down that black stallion's head again. It's the signature of the artist who made Lascaux, who painted it. It was all painted in one generation. And one has then the resonance of the introduction of the signed work at the beginning. Black Stallion painted Lascaux 20,000 years ago. And shooting off the side gallery that goes off at an angle ends finally in what is very long distance in what is called the Gallery of the Felines. The Gallery of the Felines are all lionesses who are the hunters. The maned lions, the male lions, don't do the hunting. It's the female lionesses who do the hunting. They supply the nutritive of life. And there, at the far end, you find the respect for the feminine courage, not to kill, but to spearhead the hunting so that the nourishment of life really happens. It's their form of cooking. The lionesses bring down the game. It's their way of beginning cooking. And off that is the first time that you find a human form in Lascaux, in Paleolithic art. And that human form is a man that has a bird head. And he's carrying a staff that has a bird head, because the bird is a symbol of the ability to fly in the openness of the sky. In the midst of the air, he has a head of open flying capacity. He has a spirit capacity, a spirit dimension. He has consciousness. It's a Paleolithic way of symbolizing consciousness. And he has survived the threshold of imminent death, because right where that male bird head is, we tell that he's a male because he has an erect penis drawn in, because he's been scared to death. Because there's a plunge of about 30 or 40 feet into what would have been complete darkness, would have been thrust, except that he was tied, like with a bungee cord of woven rope, 3 strands, because bits of it were found at the bottom of the shaft. And he was saved from death right at the moment where he thought that he was finished. And there are the little oil lamps that they, crouching down below, would have lit to show him. Not only has he survived, but this art expresses that. And because that symbol now is in active play for his person, his spirit, he now is able, anytime he comes into Lascaux, to have himself play with the art of the cave in its sequencing. That is not just in a line, but becomes a gestalt a woven gestalt illuminating all of his life. The animals that one respects for food, the animals that one fears for their strength, the animals that one is cognate with, like the artist for Lascaux is cognate with horses. So the horses on the side of Lascaux coming back towards this aisle that goes to the initiations has 3 grand horses. They're usually called in Paleolithic critique art Chinese horses because they're gorgeous, because they are very feminine horses. They're like circus Marc Chagall feminine horses 20,000 years ago. And one sees the black stallion has not only the power to procreate, but he has the respect for the play that those female horses are a part of the mystery of how life really continues even past death, even in face of hardship. So works of art are this way. And of course, when you look at the earliest architecture of Egypt, of dynastic Egypt, the Osirian at Abydos and the first pyramids are all Paleolithic cave temples where you have the hieroglyphics that are written on the inside of it, leading to the sarcophagus, where the sarcophagus is not to bury the dead, but to do something that is alchemical and mysterious. In Greek, the word sarcophagus means body eater. If you place a human cadaver in a limestone sarcophagus, the limestone sarcophagus over time will eat and dissolve the bone, the blood, the tissue into itself. It's like a cupellation, so that the sarcophagus eventually will be empty. It will be empty open. It means the body of that person has been translated into infinity. Not dead there, but into infinity. And then, of course, as soon as you find the complement to that, that if the body is mummified and preserved, the spirit of that body will be able to leave that body and course and come back into life every single day. And this is another form of that. So that art and holiness, person and consciousness, all come together not as integrals, but as a differential array, as a spectrum of possibility that is harmonically cognate with the cosmos. In the integral mode, one lives in the universe. In the differential mode, one explores the cosmos. Heaven is made to explore. You don't sit on a cloud to play some old harp again and play favorites. It's wide open and growing and amazingly, complexly rich, and a true home forever. This kind of an education is important because it gives us not the subjects which categorically lodge in the integral mind and stay there, and then corral experience and keep it that way, and then cognate into rituals that one has to do to toe these lines. No, it's about something else. This presentation is called Surrealism and Supranaturalism, and surrealism is important. When surrealism was announced, when it was discovered in 1924, an enormous storm had hit the art world. After the great realizations of Monet and Cézanne and Van Gogh, a number of artistic geniuses clustering all at once at the same time, in the midst of that came one of the most brutal wars of all time, World War I. Max Ernst is a very good protagonist to come through. He was born in 1891 in Brühl in the Rhineland, and his father taught in a deaf and dumb school. So that Max Ernst, from a little boy, got used to the fact that There's more than what one could say. There's more than what one could hear. Reality is obviously magically much more and deeper than that. And so as a little boy, he was a visionary. He got used, because he was around all the time of deaf and dumb children, he got used to the fact that there's something else that one can be sensitive to, and so he became a little visionary. He started doing his little sketches already as a little boy. When he was 18, he went to the University of Bonn, and he entered in and for 5 years studied philosophy. He liked Nietzsche a lot. But he also met an artist, August Macke, M-A-C-K-E, who was a friend of Kandinsky, who was a friend of Franz Marc. And Macke was into color in a very big way. And so Max Ernst began to get interested, and Macke took him to an exhibit a couple of years into his university life. And for the first time, he beheld personally real Matisses, real Van Goghs, real Munchs, real Cézannes, real Gauguins, and he was blown out. And he decided he had to be an artist because that's who he was. And just as he got to that and was beginning to try and do some things that way, he was drafted into the German military and assigned to field artillery service for 4 years, nonstop. So he was at the front for 4 years, firing shells to kill Frenchmen who were firing shells to kill him. And he loved Frenchmen. He loved French art. What in the hell's going on is the way that they would have put it. And as soon as the Second World War was over, a movement that started in neutral Switzerland, in Zurich, a couple of interesting characters, Hugo Ball, Tristan Tzara, Hans Arp, in neutral Zurich, realized that the whole culture had crumbled, that the whole civilization had come to an end, and the only real thing one could do is to shout, no, it's over. And so Dada was born. Dada was not a movement, it was an outcry. Later on, in 1971, when Max Ernst was being interviewed, he was 80 years old. And he said in his interview to the interviewer said, well, we're going to have another show of Dada. And he said, what again? Another show? Do you not understand that Dada was a bomb? It wasn't a movement. It was to yell and scream and abuse everyone of the fact that you think we're still civilized. You think we're still ongoing. Everything has ended. Every decency has ended. And one of the confirmations was that the 3 parts of Europe, that the neutral part in Zurich, the German part in Berlin and Cologne, Hanover, the really powerful industrial areas of Germany, in France, especially in Paris, that the young men who had been fighting each other for 4 years all of a sudden came together and started throwing the Dada bomb together. And Max Ernst became the star of this because he emerged by finding techniques that no one had ever developed before. One of his techniques is called Frotage, where you take a paper and you rub it over some kind of natural form like wood or some slate or something, and then you begin drawing and making works of art out of this. And so you begin having a whole different quality where there is a semi-unintentional aspect to the work where it's not just accidental, but it has emerged literally out of the grain of its existence and is not in human codified ritual phenomenality, but in the mysterious phenomenality that came out of nature. And if one's experience is flowing with consciousness, and that consciousness is flowing together then with nature, then nature, experience, and consciousness flow together in a single stream. So that one's art is not just coming out of consciousness in its differential phase, but is also receiving the complementation of the nature flow and the experience flow from the integral at the same time. And so artistic conscious experience has a mysterious natural quality to it. And that natural quality is not only that it can change, but it can create. And what it creates is real. So that the artist doesn't just create representations of something, imitations of something. The work of art is an original creation that is as real as any phenomenal thing in the universe. And that the cognate to that is instantly apparent, that the spiritual person has been made just now through creation and is a permanent, phenomenal quality to the cosmos, who does not die. Reality does not die. It has its cycles of integral, it has its cycles of differential, it has its cycling in the double complementation. But once a spirit person is established, it's called eternal life, because there is nowhere that they cannot go in any dimension, any location, any order, anywhere, anytime. It is a profound quality, and not only will a work of art in its great refinement deliver this spontaneously to one's deep appreciation if you really tune yourself to it, but spiritual persons will do that too, as well. One meets someone whose spirit is alive in this scintillating way, it's evident immediately. So these qualities, after Dada had its run from about 1915 to about 1923, it went through several stages. When it left Zurich and went into Germany, it got a German touch. When it went to Paris, it got a Parisian touch. Then there was this realization that you cannot continue just to shout no and to shout down all values. And that's when a young Frenchman named Breton wrote the Surrealist Manifesto, October of 1924. And here's a little few sentences. This book is From Baudelaire to Surrealism. It's a classic by Marcel Raymond, published about 60 years ago. During recent years, wrote Breton in the Surrealist Manifesto, I have realized the damage wrought by a certain intellectual nihilism whose malice consisted in raising upon every possible occasion the broadest and most futile question of confidence. It was in these terms then that Breton turned toward 1924's end in October, turned away from his past and from Dadaism. He was determined to open a path for a new offensive onslaught, a wave of dreams, a quest for the marvelous and for integral poetry, and wanted to have this opening. His later description of it, the mission of surrealism is to predict humanity's entry into the dazzling zone of marvels. Its aim is to use poetry and the other arts as well as all of life itself to prefigure the coming of that incredible kingdom. So that surrealism was an artistic, prophetic, differential act to bring the spirit person back, not into integral in bodies and minds, but to weave the bodies and minds into a jewel-like artistic spirit. Just about this time, Max Ernst came back. He had gone for a long trip into Indochine. Indochine was French Indochina, Vietnam, Saigon, Singapore, parts of Indonesia. He went there with his good French buddy who had fought in the First World War against the Germans, Paul Éluard. And he went with Paul Éluard because they became not only friends, the word both of them used was accomplices. And Éluard's wife at the time was Gala Éluard, and Gala Éluard later became Mrs. Salvador Dali. But the Éluards and Ernst had gone to Indochina, French Indochina, and had just returned to Paris when the Surrealist Manifesto came out. And Ernst, being that kind of scintillating visionary spirit that had gone through the First World War, then had gone through the Dada years, all of a sudden realized that his visionary spirit was not a destructive spirit, but one that was creative. And so he was staying with the Éluards in a house, Saint-Brice, just outside of Paris. And he didn't have money for a canvas, but they had all the white walls of the interior of the house, a two-story house. So Max Ernst did all these first Surrealist paintings in the world, covering the interior of that house. After the breakup of the marriage, the house was sold. The new owners put wallpaper on it. Then it was sold, and then the new owners put wallpaper on the wallpaper. And a couple of years ago, someone realized that under all this wallpaper must be the original Max Ernst murals. And by the time of the 21st century, one can take off layers of wallpaper, and there they were. And so all of the Max Ernst original Surrealist murals, Éluard's house, are all there to be seen, incredibly. Out of this came a quality in Max Ernst, where the artist eventually became for him not just someone who had survived, but who had survived the death of the world, the death of the civilization. In 1940, he painted Europe After the Rain, because he had not only gone through the First World War, but the Second World War had started and proved to be even more vicious. The deaths in the First World War were about 1 million men. The deaths in the Second World War were about 60 million human beings, most of them civilians. It was apparent to him, as to many artists, great artists, that it was up to the artist to bring through a new quality. And a painting that he did in 1958 called Tomb of the Poet shows the ancient Paleolithic spirit bird flying above the incandescent presencing of the person in the midst of a world that might have been a murky ocean of oblivion, but was like a tomb that allowed for an artistic rebirth. And that because the artists could do this, the rest of the population of the planet now had the way open, and they could do this as well. I talked about the bird spirit of Max Ernst. This is 1957. It's just called Bird. And it is the rainbow arrayed spirit bird of his person, a very holy thing. These qualities are available. There is a wonderful film, about 90 minutes, called Max Ernst, and it's available. You can find it with interviews with him. And he's speaking sometimes German, sometimes French, mostly English. And his acting role in Luis Buñuel's L'Âge d'Or, The Age of Gold, the screenplay by Salvador Dali and Luis Buñuel, and starring Max Ernst. And it's finally out on DVD. It had been savaged by reproduction prudes because it is one of the most intense films. It is the first surrealist film and feature. But its purpose is not to destroy, it's not a dada, but to show that there is an infinite transform that is available. And as you tune yourself to that, it takes courage to get over the death images that naturally have been enforced and emplaced on us through a tyrannical life, a tyrannical culture, a tyrannical civilization, tyrannical families, tyrannical self-imprisonments, tyrannical phobias. And that to overcome is not to conflict it and struggle to kill it or to win over it, but to carry through the transform in yourself through this play, so that your symbols begin to play now with artistic numinality, and they become numinous in themselves, in that interplay. And that experience becomes more and more woven into consciousness, and consciousness accepting experience in its weave as well. So that you get what the French call in fabrics a jacquard pattern, where you can see it both ways at once. You can see it either way. And it means then that the fabric of life becomes a magical field of transform that has a great ally in the play of paradox, in the feeling of irony. When Plato was rediscovered in the Italian Renaissance about 500 years ago, it was an incredible realization for the people of that time to realize that the key to philosophy was to develop the sense of irony, because the sense of irony is the only prelude that allows for the sense of wonder to blossom. And when that sense of irony allows a sense of wonder to blossom, then the play of symbols and persons commences, and art really does become art. Instead of being just phenomenally there, all of a sudden, your being with it is a playground of possibility right before your presencing. When you go to great exhibits of great art now, they are so hung that you can hardly believe it. The LA County Museum of Art had Kandinsky's compositions brought here, and Composition 10 is one of the largest canvases done by 20th century art. And it was hung so that the lights reflected off it, and you could only see it if you stood almost directly under it, which distorted the perspective. At the Getty, when they were showing some of their new Rembrandts, they were shown in such a way that you could not get a distance with them. Some of the Degas sculptures were so much against the wall that you couldn't get a sculptural amplitude to be able to see them. I remember walking away from one of the Rembrandts with my old friend Jan Sather and saying, it's still Rembrandt. You can still feel it. But you had to stand in a very special way and remember how you really can look at Rembrandts when they're hung right. More next week.